Good morning. This is January 4, Wednesday, and it's already, as you know, 2023. We are here actually for our council time agenda, which is preceded today by discussion of the 2022 biannual code updates in a special work session. I would like to ask council if you would be willing to amend the agenda for one very, very unusual matter. I just received an email from staff indicating that there is someone in the room that would like to speak on the biannual code updates, and he was not aware of when it was that he could give testimony to that effect. If you have no objections, council, I would request that we allow one public comment before work sessions, and then after that follow the usual agenda. Are there any objections from councilors to that?
Chair, this is Sue Marshall. I wonder if there is anyone else who would like to speak on the same topic.
Perhaps, but I received no other communications. Staff.
Two people are raising their hands.
I'm sorry?
Two people are raising their hands in the audience.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, councilors, what do you think? Shall we go ahead and allow all of them in a very unusual amendment of the agenda?
And I can just share also for council's information that, this is a work session. Part of this was reviewed last year. We decided to do another work session because we have new councilors, and there's no decision points. It's really just to hear an update for council from staff on the proposed amendments, and then based on just general feedback from the council, there will be an opportunity if these move forward to a hearing, and that of course the public has the opportunity to provide public testimony at that time as well.
Yes, and
Chair,
just
can I make
some information for the public. The proper time for, or one proper time for testifying on this that would already have been available to everyone in the public is during the open testimony that was available yesterday, when you could go off agenda from what was on the agenda yesterday. Let's not belabor this. I believe somebody else had a comment on council.
Yes, Chair, this is Councilor Young.
Go ahead.
I always lean towards allowing the public to be involved. However, being new to the council, I don't know the exact procedure on this, but I do feel like if we are making some form of an exception for one individual, that we should allow it for anyone. Right,
of course. Good point. Thank you. And it's just relative to the biannual code updates, if they still wish to speak. So let's go ahead and if there are no objections from the council, and are there? Let me verify that. Let's go ahead and take that testimony, and you have, as usual, 3 minutes, and then we'll immediately proceed with the work session. Please state your name when you get to the microphone.
Okay, my name is Adam Berkey, address 9104 Northeast 43rd Avenue, Vancouver, Washington. What I want, I'm here for clarification 9 on the biannual code amendment, which is the ability of outdoor recreation space to be counted in the landscaping area. At developer's discretion, clarification 9 is written to reduce total outdoor green space. What outdoor green space, just for terminology, what that means basically is the landscaping area plus the outdoor recreation space area. The zoning code, Title 40, is the law body applying numerous requirements. However, clarification 9 gives solely the developers the right to interpret and apply requirements for landscaping and outdoor recreation space. Okay, so the way that I got into this is this is 90th Street site plan, PSR 2022-3049. It was approved, there was a hearing June 23rd, approved August 4th with conditions that it meets separate landscaping and separate outdoor recreation space requirements. So far, 3 times, including the final approval decision, it is deficient in those 2 items. It does not meet, there is not enough square foot area, okay? So the reason why I wanted to bring this up and show this to everybody is just visual. Look how much space, if you go up to here, all of that is building footprint, parking spaces. It's all concrete, asphalt, and construction. There's very little area left for landscaping and outdoor recreation space area. So what I would like to say also is this is a zone change. This whole process, this whole application was a zone change R18 to R22. And what zone changes can also be R30 to R43. What happens when you start approving zone changes now for multifamily apartments is you're adding more units. Units multiply times, let's say, 200 square feet. You need more outdoor recreation space area, and then you need more parking space area. So that's the same thing on this. The building footprint.
Thank you, sir. Your 3 minutes is up. We appreciate your comments this morning. Thank you.
I'll just finish the sentence. So when the building footprints are bigger and you need more parking spaces, you're left with even less area for landscaping and outdoor recreation space, to where you're ending up with a total reduction in the green space on the project site.
Thank you, and we need to move on. Staff, is there anyone else who wishes to speak on precisely this topic?
Yes, Chair, he's coming up to the mic.
Good morning. My name is Jim Byrne. I live at 28501 Northwest 7th Avenue in Ridgefield. And I'm asking, why are we here? It seems to me that this is much more than just a code update. This is more of a policy change. And it goes back to 7 months ago when an emergency ordinance was proposed, combining 2 existing ordinances, combining them into one. It was run by the April 1st, the community development director, and she said, no, the 2 existing ordinances was appropriate and they should remain. Then the development industry, specifically through the DEEB, did an end run and went to the previous county council and asked for this special exemption, which was granted. So here we are. There's been a real dearth of data regarding this project. Citizens have asked staff for data. We haven't received it. Teresa Hardy and myself attended the December DEEB, the Development Engineering Advisory Board meeting, and were provided with no data. We were told that citizens could gather data, and I asked if citizens did, would it be accepted, and I never was given an answer. So we did. I have 2 proposals here. that they're recent. One was from 2022, the other was from 2021. Both of these proposals list landscaping and recreation lands as per the two previous ordinances. In both of these projects, the lands were allocated and there were surpluses of lands. In landscaping, there was 1,000 extra feet of square feet, and in recreation space, 900 square feet. So I thought the biennial code update was to reconcile Scrivener's errors and publication type stuff, but this is much, much more to me. So you can tell I have an accent. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. I've lived in urban areas, and I live in Ridgefield now, and I appreciate the diversity that Clark County provides. In the pros plan, the Parks, Recreation, and Open Space land, it lists a substantial deficit of park acreage. The county is hoping to fill that deficit when Camp Bonneville comes in line, but I don't think that'll happen very soon. So these lands associated with these developments are really important. And we have a list of far more developments.
Sir, I'm sorry that your time has now expired. Well, I wonder if you wish, and this is entirely up to you, sir, to have your proposal and data on file with the council for us to study. You may make that available today to staff, and then it will be made accessible to us. But that is up to you if you wish to do that. And thank you for being with us today.
Absolutely. We
Staff,
have that,
is there
and we're prepared to give
anyone
it.
else who wishes to testify?
Yes, Chair, we will have one more individual.
Two more in the room.
I'm sorry, two more in the room.
One online.
And one online.
My goodness, it's interesting how this came about this morning. This has never happened before with regard to a work session. But I think maybe this substantiates the point that doing what we're doing to receive this testimony in an unusual departure from our usual agenda is important.
Thank you, Council Chair Bowerman. My name is Mike Odwin. I'm a member of the Development and Engineering Advisory Board who brought this to the Council's attention originally as we requested the interim ordinance, and have been working very closely with staff on the proposed code amendment. Just want to clarify for those new members of the Council that this really doesn't change anything in the code. There is a requirement for 20% landscaping in all multifamily projects. There's also a specific requirement for providing shared outdoor recreation space per size of bedrooms in each multifamily unit. The only thing that this does is it clarifies that there can be an overlap of the landscaped portion of the shared outdoor recreational space also count towards the 20% landscaping. That's it. If they have to remain separate, there's a risk that, as provided in information provided to Council previously, that we cannot achieve the maximum densities in some of these higher density zones. I will keep my comment short, as I have already testified in front of the Council several times. I'm sure my testimony has been provided to you in the record. I'm also here to provide any technical information regarding this particular issue, and would be happy to answer any questions as the work session proceeds. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Before I get started, I just want to thank you for this change. I think what happened was with meetings being canceled in December and the not being understanding when the public comment was, and then asking at the desk yesterday morning if we could speak. Instead of speaking yesterday, we chose to speak today. So we apologize for the misunderstanding, and we appreciate the opportunity to speak with you, okay? My name is Teresa Hardy, And there is a significant impact on this by allowing this to go through in the biannual code amendment, because what it does is it reduces landscaping and recreation space for our multifamily housing, which is our high-density housing, our R18, our R22, our R30, and our R43. What we have continued to ask since that first meeting on July 5th was, where's the data and analysis? And Mr. Odrin did present a case study. It was a hypothetical case study. We've asked for real data, looking at what past projects have been done, what projects are currently being done, what projects are pre-application and in the process, to say, okay, has this been successful? Has it not been successful? When we're moving forward here in looking at what we're doing in the county, all this information has been sent to you. I sent you emails that show you the part on the Planning Commission, Temple Lens, and the DEEB meeting that we had, where they talked about promising us data and they never did. If you go back and look at the Planning Commission, I'm not going to have time. I was going to let you hear what Brian Eng said. He said this is not a biannual code amendment. This needs to go to policy, and I would agree. And so taking this beyond, we're doing a lot of development, but what's our overall vision? What's our mission? What's our strategic plan for the county? I went on the county webpage, I did a Google search, and our vision is from 2016. We're working on our 2025 comp plan and our growth management, and we have a vision. We have a vision statement, a mission statement, and a strategic plan that is back in 2016 with Medora and Milky. Here it is. It's on the back wall. Perhaps at your council retreat, we need to look at how is this county moving forward. Are we going to do this kind of development with our multifamily housing without an overall vision here? We have a county of over 500,000 people. We need an updated plan to how we're moving forward and making these smaller decisions. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Chair, we have one individual online. Please go ahead.
Hi there, this is Jackie Lane of Battleground. So first off, as others have said, this is hardly a Scrivener's error. Sorry, my other phone went off. Or a clarification is a significant change to code with obvious benefit to the development community. It is our understanding that it was requested based on a specific project need originally. The recommendation comes from DEEB, which represents the building industry. This recommendation should be evaluated for impacts to the residents and neighbors of the developments affected, which DEEB cannot be expected to do based on its defined membership. My request is that it be pulled from the fall biannual code amendment package and evaluated independently. Input should be sought that represents the impacted communities, residents, and neighbors of the type of development affected. Input should also be sought from the cities in whose urban growth areas these developments will occur. And I agree with the prior speakers as well. And thank you very much for this opportunity to speak on this. Thank you.
And is that all the members of the public, staff that wish to speak?
Yes, that's all, Chair. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you all. And we now turn to the biannual code updates discussion work session starting with April 1st. Welcome this morning.
I'll hand it over to staff here as well, just as a kind reminder that I mentioned earlier that a lot of these biannual code updates were presented to council last year. They'd opted to do a second one this year with our new council. There's no final decision today. It's for your feedback and input, so then staff will move forward appropriately, and if at a hearing, there'll be additional time for public comments. So I'll hand this over to April and her staff.
Thank you, Kathleen, and good morning, Chair Bowerman and Council, and Happy New Year. We have a work session to update you on our first biannual code update in over 2 years. This is also the first time anyone on my staff has done the biannual code updates. So it has been a learning process all the way through. I have different staff that will be discussing different sections. Ted will be the first to present, and he'll be presenting land use as the land use manager. Jennifer Reynolds will be presenting development engineering. Dan Young will be presenting for the fire marshal, and I will be presenting for animal control. Feel free to ask questions as we are presenting, as this is what it is designed for you. These biannual code updates are on the agenda for January 17th. And with that, I'd like to introduce Ted.
Thank you, April. So April gave the introduction. We'll go ahead and move on to the next slide. So this is kind of a background slide of the biannual, what the biannual code amendment is in the process. So these are traditionally updated or completed at least once per year, usually once per year, I would say, despite the name. The process was previously put on hold due to the pandemic. The last amendment process was 2019. The updates are intended to address relatively minor code amendments, Scrivener's errors, reference updates, cleanups, clarifications to the code, and minor policy items. So this slide shows the process staff has completed and will complete for this year's biannual code amendments. We began with staff meetings to determine what code sections should be included. This list was then further reviewed by the community planning team, as well as the attorney's office. As you can see, we then met with council in a work session format for guidance to proceed. And then we also met with DEEB, the Development Engineering Advisory Board, on September 1st for their review and recommendation. On October 20th, we presented the Title 40 part of the amendments to the Planning Commission at their public hearing where they recommended approval. The council should have a list of the proposed amendments in front of them. With the following slides, we will go through and briefly explain each amendment. As we proceed through each of the amendments, as April indicated, Donna Goddard will present those associated with code enforcement and animal control. Dan Young, those associated with the fire marshal's office, Jennifer Reynolds with those associated with the development engineering side of things, and then I will speak to the amendments specific to land use. So with that, we'll go ahead and proceed, and fire and code enforcement will go first.
And I think that's you first.
Good morning, Dan Young, Clark County Fire Marshal. This is a proposal to update the fee table to include open burning fees. We need to update this to reflect what we have been charging. This was recommended by the state auditor through an audit process, and that the fee was also what is being currently charged by the Washington State Department of Natural Resources. So this is just to clean up a little missing part of our code. Then if we can go to the next slide. Okay, and then this one is a proposal to update the fee table for fireworks, retail stand and display. The rationale for this is state law requires that we cannot charge more than $100. So we're just getting our fee table updated back to where the state law is. So that's what this one is about. If there are any questions for me?
Madam Chair?
Yes, Councillor, go ahead.
Yeah, the burn permits, what does that even apply to? What kind of burn permits are we talking about?
Oh, okay. So these are for burn permits for piles that are in excess of 10 feet round, basically. It's for burning the vegetation from your property. So if you have 10 foot or less, it's a self-issue permit. If it's over the 10 foot, typically these piles are 20 to 30 feet in size. We charge a fee that we would then go out, we collect the fee, then we go out and make sure that they're following all the procedures that they need to, such as distance from combustibles, that they have a water source available, what are their plans for if something goes wrong. So that's what those fees are for. It's just for the open burning of vegetation on a property.
Okay, thank you. And if I understood the fireworks permits, they are set by the state? There's no variability county to county?
Yeah, correct. One thing that we did do a few years ago, we went to the fireworks industry and we do charge $142, I think it is, or 156. Sorry, I don't have it. For a tent permit. So the ones that are in a tent, we get the $100 plus the 142 to inspect those. If they're in a like a booth or something, then it's just $100. But yes, that is set by state law.
Thank you.
Chair, I also have a question.
Yes, go ahead, Councilor.
Yes, I was curious, do we have, as far as the burn pile permits, do we have an issue of non-compliance with that, or fires being generated by not using proper procedure and not receiving a permit for them?
Yes, we do. We do it. Sometimes we do. Typically some neighbor will call, or there's smoke that is going across the neighbor. They call us, we go out. In those cases, we have the discretion to issue a fine of $250 for burning without a permit. And typically the ones that we go out to that we find, it's actually a $500 fee, because most of those people are burning like construction debris and stuff like that they're not supposed to. So that's part of the process with the permit fee, is we talk to them about what they can and cannot burn. So typically when we go out, when somebody hasn't, then it's a $250 fine, and can be $500 depending on what they are burning.
How much is the permit fee?
That's $142.
Okay, because one of the things that I'm curious about, and I'm all for making sure that we, find a way to pay for all of the services that we provide, and a permit fee is a really good way of doing that. But I also do know that when there is a permit and a requirement and a fee for it, that it does tend to generate some non-compliance. And I'm curious if we have ever looked at possibly making a permit free and maybe getting better compliance out of that, more people willing to buy a permit and maybe creating less fire issues. It's just total idea. And so I just wanted to think what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, so we do have what we call a self-issue, which is no charge if you keep your piles under 10 feet. So there is that part. It's typically, these are for land clearing, when somebody is just clearing, let's just say an acre or two to put their house on, and they have bigger piles. Therefore, we get the piles built and they get done, as opposed to having a 10-foot pile that they keep stocking and it burns for days. So we're trying to mitigate both ways. But yeah, if
Perfect.
you do have 10 foot or less, it's free.
Great, that's perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I hear no further questions, so April, you can proceed.
All right, thank you. And I just first wanted to say too that Donna did go to the Animal Control Advisory Board with all of these, and they also are have done recommendations for these as well. So the first one is update the facility license, wild animal and dangerous dog fees. The county cost to inspect facilities is not covered by the current fee schedule. An increase is proposed to keep wild animal and dangerous dog requires additional requirements and inspections by animal control staff. So an increase in fee is proposed to more accurately reflect the costs associated with inspection and monitoring.
Chair, I have a question. This is Sue Marshall.
Yes, go ahead, Councilor.
Let me see what it was. Oh, could you speak a little bit to the need in terms of animal control, and if things have increased related to pandemic and more people doing businesses from home? Is there an increase in need that to warrant these increases in fees?
And so I can answer that very broadly, but the answer is yes. I know that Donna recently did, at the end of summer, she did an analysis of her call volume, and her call volume, not unlike Cressa, was up 30% for the entirety of 2022 when she performed that in September of 2022. So for the first 9 months, yes, up 30%. And I do know too that I'm losing the word for it right now, but their like neglect cases are, oh, Donna's here too, but their cases are also up. I think that they have at least 7 cases this year, and where they didn't have any in 2020. Donna, did you want to expand?
Well, I think I heard the question as being, is there any like increase in home businesses because of the pandemic? I will tell you that the county has not inspected facilities in any significant way in the last 7 to 8 years. So when I came on board last year, that's one of the things we looked at. And we have a position that was approved to based on these fee increases, really to go out and actually perform the work that we're required to do by code. And there are hundreds of them out there, but I don't have a sense as to if there's been an increase solely because people are operating out of their home because of the pandemic.
Thank you.
Sorry, I think I misinterpreted your question. Okay, next slide. Unless Donna, did you want to take over or did you want me to keep going?
No, that's fine. I was having technical difficulties earlier, so I appreciate you filling in, April. I'm happy to move forward and try and answer any questions. So this slide is about adding an impound fee for livestock. Okay, so there are over 30,000 horses alone in Clark County, and there we have experienced a significant increase in livestock complaints. So cruelty, animal cruelty complaints regarding livestock. Currently, there's no fee established for livestock impoundment. So if we have to take livestock because of cruelty or neglect or the conditions that they're living in, it gets expensive to do that. And so the county, this is to establish a fee to cover the cost of impounding that livestock when necessary. I would say last year we did maybe 3 cases. So it's not significant, but the cost can be significant.
Madam Chair, I have some questions in this area.
Yes, go ahead, Councilor.
And I'm very reluctant to do so because we'll probably end up filling the expansion room with the equestrian community here. But I think it's needed discussion, and this is one of those areas that kind of gets into policy, and the equestrian community is certainly a very organized community and a very valuable one. But here are my questions that are related to this, because I'd never heard the term impound fee before, and stock restricted area. I had done a fair amount of independent research when we had the uproar over code enforcement of some of our existing code. I never knew where that actually ended up, and some of it was involving businesses in areas that were not commercial, industrial, or licensed for businesses, and neighbors complain. Management of manure, real problem. We really don't have any central places for manure to be processed, and a lot of large, I'm going to go beyond horses, large animals, manure isn't necessarily processed the way our conservation district would like to see it processed, or state of ecology. They're not best practices. So where we get into this restricted area, I've seen places where they have minimal acreage, you know, maybe an acre or two, maybe 3, dedicated to horses, but then they overburden that area. I understand we have no restriction on the number of large animals per acre. Some counties in the country do. So you end up with a small acreage with a lot of horses or large animals, and it becomes just basically what you call a sacrifice lot. You know, it's all mud and manure or all dust and manure throughout the year, which impacts stormwater runoff, groundwater, any number of impacts for the community at large. So I'm wondering, what work are you doing to look at where do we restrict stock? And of course, this becomes even a more important concern as you're on the fringe of an annexed area. You know, cities, within cities, it's hard to even have chickens, certainly not large animals, but right on the border of that city, which would be incorporated at some point, you may have equestrian or other large animal uses that are really incompatible with the density that is now upon it. So how do all these relate to your impound fees, the issues that I've just raised?
Well, those are really great points and concerns, and are very valid in the community, in the rural community especially. This impound fee is just an add-on to the section of code that allows us to impound animals when we have a complaint and verified cruelty or neglect of livestock. And like I said, that doesn't happen very often, but when it does, we could be impounding several large animals that are very expensive to take care of. And we want the owner to be able to at least have an impound fee for each day that they're impounded. The larger question of restricting stock is certainly a larger discussion that if the council would like us to work on that, I believe we can partner with some restrictions in like zoning code and the animal code, and that would require some further evaluation and discussion.
So let me just follow up, and I know I'm spending too much time on this, but I guess the bottom line is I think we really need to talk and work with the equestrian community, but you know, dairy and other larger animal should be included in this conversation. And I'm aware of some of the complaints of livestock grazing in wetland area, which gets right to our causing issues with our watersheds and our lakes. So all these are related issues, but I think this is an area that really impacts on policy decisions, and we really need to include the different stakeholders. And so I'm concerned about this area, really. I mean, it kind of goes to the larger discussion that we began this meeting with the public concerned about green areas. I think this needs a lot of work and a lot of outreach.
I agree. The next slide is a proposal to increase the civil penalties. So this is penalties for cases that have, where folks have violated and have found to be violating, either upheld by a hearings examiner or no appeal, that they have violated a section of the animal control code. So the first, second, and third offenses are all being asked to be increased. They have not raised in over a decade, and we're hoping that the effectiveness of a raise in the penalties will help to strengthen a deterrent effect and hold people accountable.
And I hate to be so active today, but Leslie, so I understand the PA's office doesn't have any kind of environmental compliance, consumer fraud unit. I mean, is there any capacity in the PA's office to actually enforce civil penalties?
That's a good question, Councilor Medvegy. I don't have an answer to that. I'd have to check with the prosecuting attorney's office on that, but I'll make a note to do that.
Chair, this is Sue Marshall. I have a couple of questions.
Councilor?
Thank you. Has there been a problem with collection? It's one question. And the other one is, has the regulated community had the opportunity to have input into these changes?
I'll ask for clarification on the second part of your question.
I just wondered if this was vetted by any group of people who have livestock. What was the public engagement process related to forwarding these changes?
So these changes were developed by previous staff and recommendations based on the experiences that we're having with our current workload and suggestions. Those were then taken to the Animal Control Advisory Board and reviewed with the advisory board, who came back with a recommendation to approve. We had discussion, we made some changes where appropriate, and what you see before you has been vetted and approved by the Animal Control Advisory Board. The next step is to then, if we move forward with these, is to have then the public have the opportunity to comment.
Thank you.
This particular slide is regarding just adding the word may to the code. Not all appeals of Title VIII should be heard in front of the advisory board. So by adding the word may, it clarifies the intent. This is just adding, for found domestic animals, adding or its designated agent. This makes it consistent with other areas of the code, giving authority to any designated agent the county may contract with to provide services on our behalf. For dangerous dogs, we're requesting additional requirements for proper enclosure to just clarify what proper enclosure means. It doesn't adequately, currently the code doesn't adequately define what a proper enclosure for dangerous dogs is. So this language clarifies adequate enclosure, and it mirrors the requirements of what's actually in the City of Vancouver, which is a contract. We provide services for the City of Vancouver Animal Control Services. In addition, if any other reasonable mitigating protection measures need to be taken, it gives the animal control manager the authority to require it if necessary. The language changes are just meant to provide some clarity to the dog owner and to protect the public, as well as the animal. This one is providing additional language, giving discretion to the program manager concerning hearings examiner role. The way the code section is currently written, it conflicts with the duties of the Animal Control Advisory Board. So by adding the language, it gives discretion to the program manager to decide which violations of Title VIII should be heard by the advisory board instead of the ones that need to go to the hearings examiner. This is, again, responding to these increased calls and complaints regarding cruelty to livestock. This is a requirement to ask for some sort of structure to provide sufficient protection for livestock. Currently, there is none in the code. Again, these complaints are on the rise, and in most cases, there's a correlation between the neglect and lack of shelter provided. So to reduce neglect and cruelty to livestock, a minimum shelter requirement is proposed.
Councillor Medjugorje had a question about this when we first presented it, and just for clarification, just in case, the minimum is only a roof. It doesn't have to have sides on it. So I know that we wanted to be clarified. It's just something to keep them out of rain and snow.
Right. It could be even, the temporary structures, the membrane structures, we find a lot of those that, you go buy at Costco and put up, and that's adequate shelter. It's something. This is adding additional language concerning tethering and confining and restraining of animals, restricting the use of the prong or self-tightening collars. The use of prong or self-tightening collars can cause severe injury or death to animals that are tethered. And the proposal is to prohibit the use of these collars when an animal is tethered. We're not talking about when you take your dog for a walk. We're talking about unsupervised tethering, which can cause harm, death, and is considered cruelty. This one is just to remove gender-specific language in the code. This one is a change in an appeal period. The current appeal period is 30 days. When we issue an abatement order, we generally require action within 7 days, sometimes less, to fix a problem or to require an animal to be seen by a veterinarian for care. When they file an appeal, it can sometimes take up to 60 days to get it scheduled before a hearings examiner, which we think is a long time and can result in continued suffering or injury. So we are requesting a reduction of the appeal period to provide an expedited appeal to ensure proper care is timely provided to avoid further injury or possible death. And that's all for me.
Okay, it looks like I'm back up. We're into the land use code amendments for the biannuals now. This one is a Scrivener's error correction. The amendment corrects the Scrivener's error where the code contains the incorrect cross section to another code section. So this just corrects that cross section location. This one corrects an error where the setback in the table is inconsistent with the reference to note. So this will add that correction to the code so that there's consistency in the table and the note. So this is the amendment that was spoken of earlier in the hearing or in the meeting. This amendment was requested by deed and will allow outdoor recreation space to count toward the required landscaping for multifamily projects. Historically, planners for the most part have allowed these two code sections to cross over. However, that's been inconsistent, so we're requested to provide clarity in the code on that to allow for that crossover. Since the last council meeting, the code, we have added an amendment which was approved by the Planning Commission. That amendment would ensure that the area allowed for crossover, so that area of recreation space that's allowed to count toward landscaping, that area must comply with the definition, the county definition of landscaping, as well as the county definition of recreation space. So this would address some of the concerns that we've heard that landscaping will be lost. So, for instance, the area of recreation space that can count toward landscaping, the landscaping requirement, for instance, we wouldn't be able, with this code section amendment, we wouldn't see a pool or a tennis court or an outdoor workout area. That area allowed to overlap and count toward the landscaping requirement must still comply with the definition of landscaping in the county code.
Chair, this is Sue Marshall. I have a few questions. I guess go ahead. We've heard, I think, this is Sue Marshall. I have a couple of questions I'd like to ask. So we've heard, I think, a little conflicting information from the people who presented information today that this would have no impact or that it would have some impact in terms of reducing the amount of land required for both recreation and landscaping. So does this mean that there would be a net loss of land for both of those functions?
So with the amendment, we wouldn't see a net loss of landscaping or recreation space because the crossover area, so 20% of the site needs to be landscaped. Say 10% of the required landscaping, 10% of that 20% can be used, can cross over with recreation space. So the intent of this code is to require that part, that 10% as an example, that might be able to cross over as recreation space to meet both landscape and recreation space requirements. So the intent there is to not lose landscaping because it needs to meet the landscape requirement in code, and not lose recreation space because it also, that 10% would also have to meet the requirements under recreation space. Both of those definitions are relatively broad, and there are many instances where those two can cross over. Community gardens is one, passive seating areas, picnic areas, for instance, could count as both landscaping and recreation space. So with the amendment to this section, we had hoped to address that concern that we might lose something with this code amendment. So hopefully with that, we are not going to lose either landscaping or recreation space.
So, and I want to focus on that, and I know Councilor Marshall has additional questions. First and foremost, so the public knows, I mean, we rely on the public to a great extent on, and of course Steve and other entities in informing the council, because we have no legislative drafting or research capability. It's part of our charter that, this all resides with you, the executive. So we really don't have the ability to independently research this. But I'm concerned about what you just said. I originally voted against this at the first hearing because we were told by staff when the question was asked, would there be a net loss of open recreational space? And the answer was yes, there would be. I just think I heard you say that no, there would not be. I mean, I ultimately voted to approve that as an interim emergency ordinance because it was sold to us, if you will, or advocated to us that this really just streamlines, clarifies the process because a lot of staff were interpreting the two areas differently and perhaps overlapping, and that it kind of was just clarity for the code. So I am concerned that there is going to be a net loss, despite what you just said. And how do we resolve that? ambiguity, because that then does get into policy decisions. And, you know, we're on the cusp of doing a comp update. We have increasing growth. We have an increasing need for housing. There's no question about that. I mean, these are all related issues. And to Councilor Young's point, you know, code enforcement is a huge aspect of this, because a lot of people are unaware of our code, or they simply ignore it. And we don't have the capacity to actually go out. We've had very precious few instances where county staff driving by said, geez, that person's building a lot of cottages on their property and they haven't pulled a single permit. Or we had someone build a factory right in the middle of a residential development, and staff actually went out of their way to fit that in, even though the neighborhood complained there's no design in our code. You know, we don't have any design restrictions. We build on ridge lines. A lot of communities prohibit that. But it also ultimately gets down to code enforcement and what limited capacity we have to do the right thing. I thought it was an embarrassment when that factory went up in a residential neighborhood, and it's still there today, and I'm sure being used for an unlawful purpose. But there's no ability to actually get into that and enforce our code. But I'm going to turn this back over to Council Marshall's questions, unless you do have some clarification on how we can find out if there really will be a net loss of green space as we build and build and build.
So before staff answers before staff answers that specific question, I do want to talk about the code language and how it was applied with regards to this specifically. It's my understanding that the code language is actually very clear. Staff did not necessarily follow that historically. So when we looked at the code, now we're moving forward following what's actually in code. Some of the development team did not like that, which is why that was actually presented by Deeb. That was brought up by Deeb, not by staff. So, and we respect that, and you know, council made that decision to move forward, but the code language is actually very clear on the rec space versus landscaping. I think also with the blue building, right? Is that the one we're talking about? I think that was constructed under, and it met code at the time. Granted, they may not be doing what they should be in that that facility, you know, but we may not have the mechanism to go inside and look. But that was built within the restrictions in code. And with code enforcement,
I just want to, that was built under ag exemption, which someone basically fraudulently said it was for agricultural purpose. So I think I disagree with some of the issues that we have with that building that is there.
And, yeah, and then with code enforcement, we do have minimal staff in that area, but the staff take the approach of trying to get compliance, you know, and so that it's really working with the constituent to become compliant, and then if not, then there is a specified process in which they go through to get them in compliance, up to lien. If it's a house issue, we can put a lien on their house. You know, so we're trying to be more intentional with that, and have been, just like with animal control, of taking things to court when people are not following code and they're not in compliance. So with the minimal staff, I will say the staff's doing a great job. It is a small staff, and for, you know, 500,000 people in this county, granted, not all of those codes are within our jurisdiction. I think we have less than 10 that are out there. So, you know, we certainly want to support them, but I will let staff talk about the impact, the net loss or gain or neutral with regards to the code change.
Thank you. I would like to clarify, I apologize, Mr. Counselor, if there was a misunderstanding. It was never the intent to lose recreation space. It was never the intent for there to be a reduction in recreation space to meet this requirement. I think the concern, so the recreation space, the required recreation space has to exist under this code section. The crossover would take, so you have the required recreation space, and then you have 20% landscaping on these projects that is required. What this proposal would do would be to allow some of that 20% landscaping to count toward or it's part of the recreation space to count toward some of that landscaping. So you'd still have your full recreation space, but some of it would be able to count toward that 20% landscaping. The intent was always to keep the recreation space in place. And the concern there was, and I think the concern you're hearing from the public is there's a perceived loss of landscaping on these projects. So the clarification that we added to this code section, and previously there could potentially have been a net loss of landscaping, the required landscaping, if certain recreation space elements were installed, like a pool or a tennis court or a workout area, which is not landscaping. So we clarified this amendment by adding the last sentence. You'll see that last sentence that says, additionally, such outdoor recreation space shall comply excuse me, with the county definitions of both landscaping and recreation space. So if you're going to take some of that landscaping and say we want to count it toward recreation space, it must meet the requirements of recreation space, but it also must meet the definition of landscaping. And like I said before, that is hopefully to clarify that we're not losing, the intent was never to lose recreation space. And with this clarification, that we are still going to have the landscaping in place as well, as identified in county code, in the definition of landscaping in county code.
Let's return to Councilor Marshall, and then I have some follow-up questions to what you just said after the councilor has spoken.
Thank you. I don't know, it sounds like kind of a circular discussion about whether or not we're losing any land, but I believe if there's an ability to build more, which is some people's argument, we need to clarify this so that we can build more. There's got to be some land that they're building more on to accommodate it. So, I think fundamentally that this, I listened to the Planning Commission deliberations on this, and I don't think there's any way really to look at this and see that it's just a Scrivener's error. It's clarification of language based on how people and the public have reacted to this, and see it directly as compromising what the code clearly says. And, my question is, how did we get to this point? At what point did the staff start interpreting it differently or applying it in some different way? How long has this been going on? Can it just be, is it a training issue of staff that they need to better understand how to apply the code? It just seems like it's more complicated and really gets into the policy issues. And the impact is, for the people who are going to be residing there. And a lot of this infill, and there'll be infill, and we need to have infill, and we need to have multifamily housing and greater density. But you need to also be considering the neighborhood if these developments are going into single-family housing neighborhoods, that a few feet here or a few feet there can make a difference in terms of less impact to the neighborhood. So I'll leave it at that. But I would agree that this should not be part of the update, the biannual update of the code changes, and we should go through a policy process. And I wonder if we had started doing this as a policy from the get-go, where we would be at today. Thank you.
My question and comment is a little bit different in that in following up on your statement about the net loss or lack thereof in accommodating an overlap. I'd like to see the data that back up how we get to that perspective. And here's why. Sometimes when we look at overlapping data, the actual total, in this case, land, would become less. And that's what I'd like to see. As that overlap is accounted for, is there actually a reduction in the total? because if there is a net loss somewhere, whether it be on one side, the recreation side, or on the other side, the landscaping side. And it's only by looking at the data that we can really see that. So what I will do when we receive those data is put the code out in front of me, right along with those data, and then it will be clear exactly what the effect of the proposal is. So would that be doable?
It would be, Chair Bowerman. May I clarify a couple of things?
Please.
Okay. So just a little bit of background. So historically, landscape and rec space was allowed to overlap. In the last 7 years, the majority of the time, because the two definitions in our code have overlapping language, like community garden, trails, passive seating areas. Those are in both of the definitions. So we were trying to be consistent. Actually, that's how we found the interpretation discrepancies between planners. Ted has done a great job since he has been the land use manager, and he was having weekly meetings about interpretations that might have been inconsistent, and then they would come together and find a consistent interpretation which all planners would use. That's how we came to this. So it was training. It came to my attention, and I interpreted the code and said that landscape was separate than rec space in our code. I said that it said that, as did a hearings examiner, because one of these projects did go to a hearings examiner. And that the code would have to be changed to be able to move forward with approving these proposals. So that was my interpretation. I interpret the code without opinion, but with a lot of research. So, Chair, to your question or your comment, yes, there could be a net loss in land. What Ted was saying is they will still have the 20% required landscape, and they will still have the 20% required rec space. But if they are allowed to overlap, yes, a developer could make a project that had less square footage. But not necessarily either, and especially outdoor, because the recreation requirements could all be inside the building if they wanted it to be. So if they want to put a swimming pool and a workout room and inside and a pool area, like a shooting pool area, you could have that all inside, and none of the rec space is required to be outside. So it could, and for a developer, it probably would. We have many instances in the last 7 years where these multi-family apartment complexes were allowed to overlap. But I think that, and I'm trying not to insert my opinion. I think that if you were to look at the two projects, if you were to look at a project that were able to the overlap historically has not been significant. And maybe, well, and could possibly create more outdoor space because they're allowed to make these rec spaces outdoor because they're allowed to overlap with the landscaping. We are protecting the 10% landscaping, which barriers these projects against other parcels around them. So that 10% cannot be used. So we're only talking 10%, but yes, in total, they could, in theory, have less land for a whole project, yes. But also I want to clarify, there was public testimony earlier about parking spaces. There is a requirement, parking spaces, if a developer were able to add a couple of more apartments with bedrooms, they do their calculations based on that. And so this would not affect the parking requirements of these multifamily homes.
Thank you, April. And that does clarify, frankly, precisely what I suspected was the case. And to indicate that there would be less total square footage of the land involved, is not necessarily a bad thing or a good thing. I think the way that we evaluate that from a policy perspective is to see the data and to look at the data and to compare that to code. I kind of don't think that many developers are going to be adjusting all of this by taking out an indoor pool or, I'm sorry, that piece of it doesn't quite compute with me. But I think that there can be adjustments made by the developers. But are there? Or is it actually changing our living space in those areas? And that's what I'd like to see with the data. So if that is possible before we take our policy votes or our votes on these, that would be, I think, extremely informative.
I can get you an example before the 17th.
That'd be great. And actually, more than an example, I think we need to see in the aggregate, what is the impact of these changes on our lands? And I know that is a tall order, but hopefully relatively available already, because I know you collect a lot of good data as you go along. So anyway, thank you for that important clarification. I think that helps in the evaluation a great deal. Are there other comments from council?
Yes, Chair, I have some questions and comments as well. And, after this whole discussion, it really dawns on me, it appears that you could potentially, I don't know if realistically it would happen, but you could potentially achieve all of the rec space requirement in the landscaping requirement. And I've heard policy, I've heard opinion many times. So I really do agree that this is a bit more than just a minor amendment. I think the issues that we're confronting here are really from a policy perspective. And so I feel like this should go through a more onerous process, a more involved process to make a decision like this. However, it's also complicated by the fact, what does staff do in the interim until that process takes place? And hopefully that process won't take too long. One of the things that I would be curious about, and this also is something that led to my thoughts on what that I just spoke about, is I would like to get examples of projects that have been both ways, projects where 20% and 20% have been achieved, and projects where 20% overlaid have been achieved. So I can kind of understand what the significance is, the difference, because we look at it on paper, it's not the same as being there in real life and experiencing it. And then it comes down to what our priorities are and what the intent of the original ordinance was behind that recreation space, and how important is that in our community. And then it also goes back to the building perspective that I often compare to the auto industry. There are the Hyundais and the Kias, and there are the Lexuses and even higher up. And I'm a big fan in housing of having all options available. So I think that is something that we really need to work through from a policy perspective. How much rec space do we want to require? How much land space do we want to require? And do we have exceptions to that, or do we have allowances or variances or different opportunities? Because not every parcel is created equal. And so one parcel can be very difficult to achieve 40% of your land space not able to be used as a building footprint, whereas others might be easier or more challenging. So I think that we should be digging into the depth of that issue. What are we currently, what is our current process now? Are we approving with the overlay, or are we approving only at 20% and 20%?
Currently, the interim ordinance is in effect until January 29th. So they
Thank you.
Get proposals through.
Again, kind of back to that policy perspective, because I can see the again, it comes back to affordable housing. The drive to create that affordability, I can see in this situation with the language may very well end up with a lack of recreation space being created, and similar to Chair's comments, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing because I haven't been able to experience it personally. So again, it comes back to that policy conversation. And one of the comments that I heard at one of the DEEP meetings was about a display that showed that maximum density was virtually impossible to be completed with the full 20 and 20%. So I think that that would be relative to that discussion, that information to bring forward to us. And I also, I mean, this is kind of a data thing. I do agree that we do need to be gathering some significant data to see what are the impacts, you know, what has resulted from the way that we've interpreted it up till now. And then again, back to that same question, we also, I want to be sensitive at all times to the affordability crisis that we're experiencing, and we need to be careful in the decisions and the policy that we make. Is that creating a further burden on affordability? And if it is that community benefit that we're generating enough to override that? Because it's always a question of two things. You know, that we always have that issue of demands on property. We just don't have enough of it. That's all there is to the conversation. And I was also curious, April, you had mentioned a little bit about this, but I wanted to perhaps to clarify a little bit more what led to your, because in that original DEEP meeting, I got the understanding that you really believe that it should be 20% and 20%, but now the staff recommendation is that overlay. I would just ask my final comment if you'd be willing to comment on that.
Chair Bowerman, are you okay if I address that?
Yes, of course, April. Okay. Please do.
So,
thank you.
A couple of things about that. I am the interpreter of the code, and I believe the code says that they need to be separate. I did not insert my opinion about whether I think it should be or not, because I feel like that's not my job. It's actually the council would put policy changes into place or code changes into place. So I believe that they are two separate, that they were two separate, but not that I believe that they shouldn't be able to overlap. And I have done a lot of research about the landscape versus rec space, and I myself, I can provide you with the examples. We have, we went back 7 years. We have all the examples of where they were allowed to overlap and where they weren't, or where we think. Remember, this is, they could only overlap in the times where the two definitions were able to overlap, and so it's actually hard to interpret whether, but you can tell when a staff member or when a planner said these two things need to be separate, and when they didn't say that. So you just make you make observations. At Max and I, my deputy director, we did go out to 2 examples, one where we knew for sure that they were not allowed to overlap, and one where they were allowed to overlap. And 2, because I, like you, I like to go and see it, and I wanted to experience it for myself. Personally, it was not, you could not observe the difference with just your eye. But Mike Odrin from DEEP did give a case study, which I will provide to you, and I think that that's the one you're talking about in DEEP. So I'll provide that to you, because in his case study, there would be a loss of square footage, or a loss of outdoor space, but he would still be able to provide the 20% and 20%. There'd just be some overlap. So I think that my interpretation was what the code says, not what my personal opinion. And I don't know if I particularly have a personal opinion, and I don't feel like I should. I just believe I know what the code says, and I made that interpretation based on it. But I will provide Mike's example, his case study. I will provide the examples. They're already ready. We had to give them to several people that requested them, including DEEP and the Friends of Clark County. So I think I addressed
Yes, you did. I think the last question that I would have would be for staff in general. Would it be appropriate to pull this item from the biannual and have a more comprehensive discussion on it? And if we were to do that, how would this proceed up until we address that? How would staff move forward in terms of their interpretation of the code?
I can answer one of those, but I might need Steve Archer's help on the other. And that is until the 29th of January, projects would be able to come through with the interim ordinance that we have in place currently. But that does expire with 6 months unless it was extended by council, I believe. And then I might need Steve to help me with I do just want to clarify too why we put it on biannuals. And that was because historically, in more cases than not, it was allowed to overlap. And that's why we did think that it was a policy cleanup. I mean, it is a code change because of the way I interpreted the code, but the reason why we thought it was in line with biannual was because of the historical interpretation of the code. So Steve, am I correct in saying that they would have until January 29th unless the council extended the interim ordinance?
Chair, may I be?
Madam Chair.
Let's get an answer to that question that April had on the 29th, if we may.
Chair Bowerman, this is Kathleen. So it's my understanding that after January 29th, if the council wants to consider extending it for another 6 months, we would have to have another public hearing. So we would have to notice the hearing and allow public comment for the interim ordinance to continue another 6 months.
And with regard to Councilor Young's second question, I intended to bring that up also, but only after discussion has more or less completed and questions have been answered, such as the important one that you just asked, April. There was someone else with a comment. Is it a staff member?
Madam Chair.
That was I.
Yes, sir, what is your name?
Oh, Madam Chair, this is Steve Archer, Deputy Prosecuting Attorney. May I be recognized?
Yes, you certainly may.
Thank you. And April had posed a question with regards to, I believe was with regards to removal of the recreation space portion from the banners. Is that correct, April?
The question was, what happens if we take this off of January 17th hearing? How do we go forward interpreting landscape versus rec space?
Well, I believe the answer would be that you would interpret it according to the code that's in effect, as you mentioned, and I believe the county manager mentioned that the interim ordinance will remain in effect until January 29th unless it is renewed by council. And so the interpretation be according to that while it's in effect. After that, whatever is in the code will be what you interpret by. Thank you.
Thanks. And was there anything else that you wish to raise, sir?
No, thank you, Chair.
Okay. Thank you so much. And Councilor Medvigi, did you have a comment?
I do.
Go ahead.
So I think where we're at right now is this. We're on the cusp of this is a major policy decision or it's just a minor clarification. And we've had some controversy with this right from the very beginning. A lot of news coverage, a lot of comments from the public. And we're here today, pretty much with the same discussion. And I've heard some variance even today in the presentation by staff on whether there's a net loss or not, whether there's anecdotal information about that or not. We had some folks hold up some examples. Of course, and with due respect to them, I appreciate that, but from here to there, to get the grasp of the granular detail of what potential changes we've experienced in this county. I've also heard from the county manager that, and from the very beginning, that this was somewhat of a training issue. It was a difference of interpretation issue by some staff. But I heard from the manager today that that's primarily been remedied as a result of all this discussion and April's work in that area. So from taking all of that into consideration, I really think this needs to be pulled out. We're going to miss a timeline on that extension. I get it. But it sounds like the training issue is resolved and there's uniformity in how these additional permits are being considered. So we can give some needed focus on what will this actually do, or what should we actually do. Are there additional changes that we should make? I mean, I have one kind of nuance issue with this kind of development myself. It's out at Heritage Farm. There's examples of experiments that the Public Works Department had done on permeable surfaces. Yet, I have no idea if any of that's ever been adopted in any of our rulemaking for parking lots of some of this development that we're going to see. And I grew up in the yellow around New York City too, as a youngster, so I have experienced urban living. We need to give some real focus to this. So I think we really should pull it out and give it the focus it deserves. We should have a work session just on this code. That's my suggestion.
Yeah, Councilor Medvigi, I actually agree with you, and I think a couple of other councilors do as well. Kathleen Otto, I have a question for you. If that were done today, is that something that we can do with a vote, or do we have to bring that up on a Tuesday as a part of the discussion of this when it's on the agenda? What is your take?
Yes, we can remove this from the agenda for the hearing, just with the majority of the council supporting that recommendation today.
Do we need a vote, or is a thumbs up okay?
Let's do a vote just to have it clear for the record, please.
Okay, I think let's go ahead and make a decision on that now. And Councilor Medvigi, would you like to succinctly state that motion?
Chair, real quick, can I just ask one clarifying question?
After, let's do after this is resolved. We'll have discussion on the motion.
Pardon?
We'll have discussion on the motion.
Okay, understood,
yeah. Go ahead, Councilor Medvigi.
Okay, I make a motion that we pull this one code section out of this process and deal with it separately.
And I'll be happy to second that motion.
I would second that.
Good. It has been moved and seconded. Now the further discussion, Councilor Young.
So I would just, if I could get it clarified, by trying to get a grasp on April's language. So if we pull this item, then the temporary ordinance will expire. And so at that point in time, I know the attorney got on and mentioned that it would go back to how we interpret the code. So do you interpret the code to be an overlay, or 20% land open space and 20% recreation space? So that is how you interpret it.
I have interpreted the code as two separate requirements, and so as a hearings examiner.
Thank you.
Are there further questions or comments on the motion that is before us?
I'm sorry, I do have one more comment. This is a challenge for me. This is a lot simpler than the decision that we're making, or a lot more involved than the decision that we're making. I do think the right process is to spend the time to really study this issue. I still struggle with reverting it back to, and what's the word I'm looking for? This weird interpretation where we are all struggling to agree on that interpretation. I don't know what the answer is to that. And then there's also the issue of, our partners in the development industry that have been doing things for quite a while now. Things are changing without any form of a code amendment. So that's a challenge. I don't know how we address that. So I feel like I don't know that we're making. I believe that we're making the correct long-term decision right now, but I also am leery about the short-term consequences of it.
So if I can just clarify again really quick, I think the current code language is clear. The staff have applied it inconsistent in the past. They have been applying it consistent for the last year since this was brought forward. The reason why the amendment is before you is because some of the developers on Deed did not like the fact that we were applying it because it impacted their work. So they were the ones that actually proposed the change, not staff. So I think we'll have clarity moving forward, but I do want to say you probably will hear from Deed. They're very, this is an important issue with them, but we can certainly schedule a work session and have more discussion. And if council desires to, I mean, if you want to have a representative from Deed as well during that work session, the council can do that as well. But we can figure that out as we move forward with the work session.
Chair Bowerman?
Yes, go ahead.
Chair Barron,
Councilor.
I'm sorry to
Yes.
interrupt. This is Leslie Lopez. I've checked the rules of procedure, and I'm concerned about taking a vote during a work session. My suggestion is that you could perhaps add this to tomorrow's council time or to a regular meeting.
I think a 3 thumbs up is just giving direction, not a vote. If we do it that way right now, which is what council usually does during work sessions.
So
I'm sorry, Leslie, I didn't understand your suggestion. You said to bring it up tomorrow at council time, but I think that's where we are today.
You can amend the agenda during council time to take a vote. It's, but not during a work session.
Oh, okay, that's fine. That's not a problem. That delays it by a few minutes, so that's okay. We'll do that. And Councilor Medvigi, we'll need your help in bringing that motion up again. Okay?
One more clarifying question, I apologize.
Yes,
what
go
kind
ahead,
of a time frame are we looking at?
Well, what I'll do is we usually, when we have work session requests, we'll get like an approximate date, go back, look at the calendar. So let me, we'll have staff look at the calendar and also work with April and her team to see how much time they need to do some preparation for it. So I would hope within the next month or two, but we'll figure that out.
Thank you.
Okay.
So I'm not.
Yes, Councilor.
I'm not real clear on what Leslie's proposing. I mean, we have traditionally given a thumbs up, given guidance to staff on a work session without taking a vote. And is that the concern, that we just simply not vote, but we just do the traditional thumbs up? Yeah, we'd like to pull this out, give it the attention, put it on its own timeline. Is that what you were
Well, let me just
making
comment.
a comment
I
about?
asked specifically about that at the get-go of this discussion, and it was suggested that we take a vote. So is there a change? If there is a change in that, they are proposing that we move that vote to council time. And I understand that to be the case.
Thank you, Councilor Medvigi and Chair Bowerman. So work sessions, as you indicated, typically I understand that there is a thumbs up. So you can go ahead and do the thumbs up, but in terms of staff removing, and they're going to have to change the hearing. So that's why I suggested adding it as a motion for discussion during council time, just typically because that's not done during a work session.
So, fair enough. I mean, I always want to follow the PA. I don't want to.
Well, I want to be sure I understand the PA. So if we do a thumbs up now, do we need to do a vote later?
Yes, in terms of telling staff to, basically, you're giving them the thumbs up that council's direction is that we don't want to have this during the January 17th hearing. The motion during the council time will be appropriate as well.
Okay, let's give the thumbs up for not having this during the January 17 hearing, but pulling it for, as had been suggested earlier. I believe that is giving that direction as affirmative. So, you know, I just want to say this has seemed a little bit controversial as far as, do we vote? Do we give a thumbs up? Whatever. Let's not lose the fact that Ted and April, we thank you very much for the work that you're doing on this, because we understand that it has been controversial for a lot of reasons that are not of your making. But thank you very much for dealing with them as you have. So now, is there more of the work session? April?
Yes, Chair. And I think Ted will go on with the next item on the biannual code update.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the council. Moving on, so this is a clarification. This will clarify that a wall is required and not a fence in this section. There has been some confusion with how this section of code references another section that is more specific to fencing. This clarifies that the reference is associated with screening and visibility, and that a wall cannot be substituted for a fence. So again, this is just simply a clarification to clear up some of the confusion. This is the RC1 and RC 2.5 are added to this section to be consistent with the other rural zones. It is unclear why these two zones were originally not included in this section other than an oversight. So this just provides some consistency in this section to include all the rural associated zones. And now we are getting into the development engineering portion of the presentation, and Jennifer will take over.
Good morning, Council. Jennifer Reynolds with Development Engineering. This first one speaks to the transportation standards, just removing redundant information or redundant code language in the code regarding driveway paved back. Doesn't really change the applicability and just removes the language overall from the code. Next slide, yes. This next one creates a separate definition for public and private alleys. Currently, the definition is really just for a public alley, kind of with the onset of, or the adoption of the narrow lot standards a couple years ago. The use of private alleys has become more prevalent, so it really just kind of provides definitions for both of those and where, when and where alley would be publicly maintained versus privately maintained. Next slide, please. This next one is kind of related to the first one about driveway paved back. It's really moving the section, or not necessarily moving the section, but referencing the applicability for driveway paved back and making it more applicable to all permits that require access to a public road. Right now, the section that it isn't really, can't be necessarily applicable to all the permits that we've been applying to it to in the past. So now by moving it, it can be consistent with how we are applying it. This one is just adding the term existing into this code language, really just not allowing a development to come in and create flag lots or joint driveways that don't meet code, and more allowing this exemption for driveway spacing to only apply to those existing driveways and flag lot driveways. This one is about driveway length and just adding the terms modified or extended rather than new. I think right now the code just says new, but there are times when a driveway is modified or extended. So just applying the same turnaround and turnout standards to driveways that are also modified and extended through the building permit process. This deals with just the classification of road mods as they apply to turnarounds, and this is really for turnarounds that are on driveways or private roads and private driveways, just allowing those to be a minor deviation rather than a technical. Right now, technicals require them to be prepared by a professional engineer. They require a little bit more review time by staff. So by reclassifying these as a minor, it lets a homeowner or someone that's not an engineer prepare those in less time and less fee associated with a minor deviation for just an alternative turnaround design on a private road or driveway. This for the traffic
Madam Chair,
impact.
can I, before we go on, could I ask a clarifying question about?
Yes, Councilor, go ahead.
So there are two questions, and the first one I think is easy. At one point, when you have a development coming in, you have to pave back from the public roadway. When does that actually kick in? Because I've seen some examples driving around where there's actual damage to the road because the pave back hasn't, they may dump a culvert and some temporary riprap while they're bringing material to a site, and then during that process, before the pavement occurs, the roadway is actually damaged on that edge. At what point are they actually required to pave? And then I have a follow-on question.
As it relates to development, they're required to have all the pave back completed prior to construction completion or provisional acceptance of the development. So prior to kind of releasing their final site plan or their final approving their final plat, they have to have all the construction completed, and that would include the driveway paved back.
So the examples I've seen are basically people that were just not in compliance, and no one was keeping them in compliance as they were building and moving heavy equipment in and out before that paved back had occurred. Is that correct?
I don't, without knowing the exact situation, I can't really say for sure, but it sounds like it. I don't know if the examples are related to development activity or if someone pulled a building permit and was constructing a driveway for their house, or what the context of the
So I'm talking about
was.
just from single-family homes to developments. I would assume that paved back requirement applies to all, does it not?
Yes, but if it's just a building permit, then the timing on that would be prior to occupancy for that paved back to occur, or they would essentially get a road approach permit, and then that road approach permit would have to be which is inspected by our public works inspection staff. That would have to be completed before they would be able to issue occupancy or sign off on occupancy on the building permit.
Okay, so now, I mean, I'm sorry to keep going down it, but I'm not real clear now what you're saying. So it has to be done before the occupancy, not before they actually start construction.
So prior to occupancy would be meaning that they have already constructed the house and then they want occupancy of that house. It's just two different timeframes, one related to development permits like site plans or subdivisions or short plats versus just already a legal lot where they're constructing a driveway for a single house.
All right, I'll take that question offline and see if I can get my question answered differently. The other area that's what I've seen has to do with rights of way. In a rural area, you might see an existing single wide driveway that serves several homes. New homes go in, and I understand there's a rule that basically for a certain minimal driveway, you can only have 4 residences on it. And I'm wondering if that needs to be reviewed, because what I've seen is an appropriate driveway not being used and instead putting in more gravel roads across other properties to access the new home. And it seems like such a mismatch. I mean, it's not good to continue to put more roadways in when you have existing ways that you could access a property. So I'm wondering if, you know, is that related to any of these changes? Is that something we can look at? Because I've seen some really bad examples of unnecessary driveways being put in.
I don't think any of these changes kind of speak to that, and it really comes down to whether a lot has legal access to a driveway or a road that's a private road that's already in place. So that may be their only option, is to create another driveway to have access onto a public road.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
So for the traffic impact fee formula, it's really just to clarify the references to where the trip generation or pass by information is found when determining the traffic impact fees. I think right now, the way the code language is written, it references one document, but that document is not all inclusive. So this is really just clarifying where the reference to all the approved land use categories can be found to determine the correct TIF fee, rather than kind of a short abbreviated list that's currently referenced. This one is in regards to corner lot driveway spacing. It kind of reverts back to the code language we had a few years ago by taking out the references to parked cars and site distance triangles and traffic control devices, which are really not kind of relevant to this code section that talks about access. It's more, you know, site distance has its own section within the code where it talks about the standards that need to be met. So this is really just reverting back to kind of the previous, like I said, previous code language that was in code before, because it's really been difficult to implement the way this code is written, just because of the onus that it puts on the smaller, more denser developments. And I'll throw it back to Ted or April.
Okay, thank you. The actual hearing, again, is on the 17th. Staff will present the amendments in that hearing format, and at that time request approval for the biannual code amendments. With this work session, staff would just recommend approval to move forward to that public hearing, and will incorporate any changes, including the changes that were just voted on concerning the recreation space amendment. And we'll incorporate those changes and move forward to council as directed. Thank you.
Is there anything, April, that you wish to say to conclude?
Thank you, Chair. I don't think so. I think Ted hit all the points. So I think we learned through this process. It's our first time doing this process, but I think it'll go much smoother for our next one, which we will start in February.
We will indeed. Well, thank you all very much. And this concludes the work session. It is 10:53. I would propose that we begin council time in